The Texas heat pressed down like a wool blanket soaked in fire. Even as the sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the prairie grasses in shades of burnt copper and gold, the air refused to surrender its choking warmth. Nora Wayne ran through that heat, her lungs screaming, her vision blurring at the edges where exhaustion met terror. Blood traced a path down her temple, matting her dark hair to her face. Her dress, once fine emerald silk, now torn and dusty, caught on the mesquite thorns that clawed at her as she stumbled forward. She had lost one shoe a mile back. Her stocking foot was shredded, leaving crimson prints in the dust. Behind her, voices carried on the evening wind, men's voices, angry, searching. She couldn't have gone far, not on foot in this heat. When we find her, Ruby's gonna make an example. Nora bit down on her lip to keep from sobbing. She would not cry. She had not cried when her father lost everything to bad investments. She had not cried when yellow fever took her mother and youngest sister within days of each other. She had not cried when desperation and false promises had led her to Madame Ruby's door, where the promised position as a music teacher had revealed itself to be something else entirely, a cage with velvet bars and men who looked through her as if she were nothing more than flesh for purchase. But she had cried last night when Richard Thorne had come to her room with that terrible smile and those cold, possessive hands, when she had fought him, when Madame Ruby had stormed in, her face twisted with rage at the damage to her most valuable merchandise, when the madam had raised that heavy candlestick to strike her into submission. Nora still wasn't certain what had happened next. Her memory was fractured, painted in red. Ruby on the floor, blood pooling beneath her gray curls, Thorne shouting, Nora's hands empty but trembling, and then running, always running. A structure emerged from the dusty twilight ahead, a barn, weathered and gray, standing beside a modest farmhouse with a sagging porch. Smoke rose from the chimney, thin and hesitant. The property looked tired, neglected in the way of places where hope had worn thin. But it was shelter, and Nora had nothing left but the animal need to hide. She staggered toward the barn, her vision tunneling. The wide door stood slightly ajar, releasing the sweet, dusty scent of hay and horses. She slipped inside, into the blessed dimness, and collapsed behind a stack of feed sacks in the far corner. She pressed her palm against her mouth, forcing her ragged breathing to quiet, and listened. Hoofbeats, multiple horses moving fast, churning up the dry earth of the road beyond the property. The voices grew louder, then passed. The sounds faded into the distance. Nora's body went limp with relief. For now, she was safe. For now, she could rest. She curled into herself, making her body small, and let the darkness take her. She didn't hear the barn door open wider sometime later, didn't hear the measured footsteps approaching, didn't sense the presence until a shadow fell across her hiding place, and a deep voice, roughened by disuse, spoke into the silence. "Miss, I don't know who you are or what you're running from, but you're bleeding on my hay." Caleb Stone hadn't expected to find a woman dying in his barn. He had come out to check on the horses before turning in for the night, a ritual as ingrained as breathing after 20 years of working this land. The sun had set an hour ago, leaving the world wrapped in that particular darkness of the prairie, where the stars burned bright and close and the horizon stretched endlessly in every direction. He'd noticed the barn door slightly wider than he'd left it. The mare had been restless, her ears pinned back. And then he'd seen her, a woman in a torn green dress curled behind his feed sacks like a wounded animal gone to ground. Now, holding his lantern higher, Caleb could see the extent of her injuries. Blood had dried in dark streams down the side of her face. Her hands were scraped raw, one foot was bare and torn. But it was her eyes that arrested him, dark eyes that looked up at him with equal parts terror and defiance, the eyes of someone who had learned that survival meant never showing weakness. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracked and hoarse. "Please don't send me back." Caleb's jaw tightened. He'd seen that look before, in the eyes of soldiers after battle, in the faces of freed slaves fleeing north during the war, in the mirror after Sarah died. It was a look of someone who had endured the unendurable and was still somehow standing. "I'm not in the habit of sending injured women anywhere," he said gruffly. He set the lantern down and crouched, careful to keep his distance, to make himself less threatening. "Can you walk?" I don't know." "What's your name?" She hesitated, then, "Nora Wayne." "Miss Wayne, I'm Caleb Stone. This is my land. Those men who were looking for you, they rode past about an hour ago, but they'll be back. Can't say when, but they will." Fresh terror flickered across her face. "Which means," Caleb continued, his voice steady, deliberate, "we need to get you cleaned up and hidden proper if you want to stay ahead of them. Now, I'm going to help you up. I'll be as gentle as I can, but it's going to hurt. Understood?" She studied him for a long moment, those dark eyes searching his face for deception, for danger. And whatever she saw there must have satisfied her, because she nodded once. Caleb slid one arm behind her shoulders, the other beneath her knees, and lifted her as carefully as if she were made of spun glass. She was lighter than she should be, too light, the kind of thinness that spoke of hunger and hardship. She stiffened in his arms, and he felt her breath catch. "I've got you," he said quietly. "You're safe now." It was a promise he had no business making, but as he carried her from the barn toward his house, feeling the way she trembled against his chest, Caleb knew he would keep it or die trying. The farmhouse was small, 3 rooms and a kitchen, built by Caleb's own hands 15 years ago when he'd brought Sarah here as a bride. It had been clean then, welcoming, filled with the sounds of a woman's laughter and the smell of fresh bread. Now it was simply functional, clean enough, but empty of warmth. The curtains Sarah had sewn hung limp and faded. Dust gathered in corners. The only room that saw regular use was the bedroom, and even that felt more like a place to endure the night than a home. Caleb kicked the door open and carried Nora inside, setting her carefully in the wooden chair by the kitchen table. She swayed, catching herself on the table's edge. "Don't move," he ordered, already moving to the stove to set water heating. He pulled out the medical supplies he kept in the cupboard: whiskey, clean rags, needle and thread, salve, the practiced movements of a man who had sewn up his own wounds more times than he cared to count. When he turned back, Nora was staring at the room with something like wonder in her eyes. "You keep a tidy house, Mr. Stone," she said softly. "It's just Caleb. And there's no point in living like an animal just because you're alone." The words came out harsher than he'd intended. He saw her flinch and cursed himself silently. The war had taught him to survive, but it had stolen his gentleness. Sarah had coaxed some of it back, but when she died, it had gone with her. He dampened a rag with warm water and approached Nora carefully, the way he might approach a skittish horse. "I need to clean that cut on your head. May I?" She nodded, closing her eyes as if bracing for pain. Caleb worked with careful precision, wiping away the dried blood to reveal a deep gash above her left temple. It would need stitches. As he worked, he tried not to notice the bruises emerging on her throat in the shape of fingers, tried not to see the way her dress had been torn at the shoulder, tried not to imagine what kind of men would hunt a woman through the desert like prey. "This is going to hurt," he warned, reaching for the whiskey. "Everything hurts," Nora replied, opening her eyes to look at him directly. "One more pain won't make much difference." There was something in her voice, not self-pity, but a bone-deep weariness that struck him in the chest. He'd heard that same tone in his own voice after Sarah's funeral, when the preacher had offered platitudes about God's plan. He poured whiskey over the wound. Nora gasped, her hands fisting in her skirt, but she didn't cry out. Caleb threaded the needle and began to stitch with steady hands, his face close enough to hers that he could feel her shallow breaths. "You're doing fine, almost done." When he tied off the last stitch, Nora's face was pale, but her eyes remained dry. "Thank you," she whispered. "Don't thank me yet. That foot needs tending too." He knelt before her, gently lifting her torn, bloodied foot into his lap. Up close, he could see that these weren't the feet of a farm wife or a working woman. Her toes had been pedicured, the nails painted, or they had been, before whatever hell she'd walked through had destroyed them. As he cleaned and bandaged her foot, Nora spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "They'll say I killed her, Madame Ruby, but I didn't. I don't think I did." Her breath hitched. "I can't remember clearly. There was blood, and Richard, Mr. Thorne, he was shouting, and I just ran." Caleb's hand stilled. "You don't need to tell me this." "Yes, I do. Because when they come back, and you said they will, you need to know what you're protecting, what it might cost you." He looked up at her then, this broken, terrified woman who somehow still had the courage to think about his safety before her own. "Miss Wayne," he said quietly, "the men looking for you, I don't know them, and I don't care what they say you did. What I see is a woman who's been hurt and is running for her life. That's enough for me." Tears finally spilled down Nora's cheeks. "Why? You don't know me." Caleb stood, returning his medical supplies to the cupboard, taking a moment to compose himself before answering. "Because 3 years ago, my wife Sarah got sick. Fever. I rode for the doctor, but he was drunk and wouldn't come. I offered him everything I had, but he said he wasn't riding out in the middle of the night for some rancher's wife. She died while I was gone." He turned back to face Nora, his jaw set. "Since then, I've had to live knowing I couldn't save the person who mattered most. So when someone shows up needing help, I don't ask questions. I just help." The silence that followed was heavy with understanding. Nora wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "I was a school teacher," she said quietly, "in Philadelphia, before everything fell apart, before I ended up at—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "You don't owe me a story," Caleb said. "Not tonight. Tonight you need rest and healing. The rest can wait." He showed her to the small bedroom, his bedroom, the only one in the house. Nora protested, but he waved her objections away. "I'll sleep in the chair by the stove. You take the bed. Door locks from the inside if it makes you feel safer." Nora looked at the bed, a simple frame with a patchwork quilt, worn but clean, as if it were the finest thing she'd ever seen. "Mr. Stone, Caleb," she corrected herself, "I don't have words for what your kindness means." "Then don't look for 'em. Just rest." He left her there, closing the door softly behind him. Then he went to the porch, rifle in hand, and settled into the rocking chair to watch the road. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns. Somewhere out in the darkness, men were hunting. But they would have to go through Caleb Stone first, and that, he thought grimly, would not be easy. Morning broke across the prairie like a promise, all rose and gold, the heat still gathering its strength for another punishing day. Caleb had dozed fitfully in his chair, waking at every sound, a coyote's distant howl, the creak of wood settling, the rustle of wind through grass, but no riders came. When dawn light filtered through the windows, he rose stiffly and set about making breakfast. Coffee first, strong and bitter, the way he'd learned to drink it during the war, then biscuits and salt pork. Nothing fancy, but filling. He was sliding the biscuits from the oven when he heard the bedroom door open. Nora emerged like a ghost, her dark hair tumbled around her shoulders, wearing the same torn dress. She moved carefully, favoring her injured foot, one hand braced against the wall. In the morning light, the full extent of her bruises was visible, purple and yellow marks on her throat, her arms, her face. But her spine was straight, her chin lifted. "Good morning," she said softly. "Morning. Coffee's ready, food in a minute. Sit." She eased into a chair, accepting the tin cup he offered with both hands, breathing in the steam as if it were a prayer. Caleb busied himself with plates, uncomfortable with the domestic intimacy of sharing breakfast with a woman who wasn't Sarah. "How'd you sleep?" he asked, setting a plate before her. "Like the dead." A shadow crossed her face at her own words. "Better than I have in months, actually. Thank you."
They ate in silence for a while. Caleb watched from the corner of his eye as Nora took small, careful bites, as if she were remembering how to eat properly. Or perhaps she'd been hungry so long that her stomach had shrunk. The thought made anger kindle in his chest, anger at the men who had reduced this educated, dignified woman to a hunted creature. "I have a proposition," Nora said, finally, setting down her fork. "I know I've imposed on your hospitality, and I have no money to pay you, but I can work. I can cook, clean, mend clothes. If you'll allow me to stay until I can figure out where to go, I'll earn my keep." Caleb frowned. "You're injured. You need rest." "I need a purpose," she corrected gently. "I need to feel useful rather than helpless. Please." There was a dignity in her request that he couldn't refuse. He'd felt the same way after Sarah died, the desperate need to work himself into exhaustion so he didn't have to think, to feel. "All right," he conceded, "but nothing strenuous until that foot heals, and you stay out of sight if anyone comes around." "Agreed." A ghost of a smile touched her lips, and Caleb felt something shift in his chest, a sensation he'd thought long dead.
The days fell into a rhythm. Caleb rose before dawn to tend the horses and cattle, working through the brutal heat of midday, returning at sunset dusty and exhausted. He'd grown accustomed to coming home to an empty house, to the silence that filled every corner like a living thing. Now he came home to the smell of cooking, the curtains that had been washed and rehung, to the sound of humming, old hymns sung in a voice that was sweet and slightly off-key, to Nora. She had thrown herself into domesticity with an almost fierce determination. Despite her injuries, she swept and scrubbed, mended his worn shirts, coaxed his neglected vegetable garden back to life. She took his rough supplies and transformed them into meals that made him remember what food could taste like when prepared with care. More than the clean house and the good food, it was the conversation that surprised him. In the evenings, after supper, they would sit on the porch and watch the sunset, and Nora would talk. She told him about Philadelphia, about teaching young girls their letters and watching their faces light up with understanding, about her father's bookshop and how she'd spent her childhood buried in novels, dreaming of adventure, about her mother's laugh and her sister's talent for piano. "Emily was only 16, Nora said one evening, her voice distant. "When the fever took her, she was planning her first formal dance. She'd made me promise to help her with her hair." She paused, swallowing hard. "After they died, after we lost the shop and the house, I had nothing. No family, no prospects. A woman alone in the city, I learned, is vulnerable in ways I never imagined." "How did you end up in Texas?" Caleb asked quietly. Nora's hands tightened on her coffee cup. "An advertisement. A respectable family seeking a music tutor for their daughters, room and board included, in Silver Creek. It seemed like Providence. I used my last few dollars for the train ticket." Her laugh was bitter. "When I arrived, there was no family, just Madame Ruby and her girls. She said the advertisement had been a mistake, but since I'd come all this way, perhaps I'd like to work for her in a different capacity. I refused, of course, tried to leave, but I had no money for the return trip, and Ruby said I owed her for the miscommunication. She'd feed me and house me while I figured things out, she said, but the debt kept growing, for food, for lodging, for the dress she insisted I needed, and her establishment was in the middle of nowhere, miles from town. By the time I understood I was trapped, it was too late." Caleb's jaw clenched. "How long?" 6 months. 6 months of smiling at men who looked at me like I was meat. 6 months of pretending, of surviving. I never—" She stopped, drew a breath. "I managed to avoid the worst, made myself useful other ways, playing piano, serving drinks. But Richard Thorne, he decided he wanted me, and what Richard Thorne wants, he buys or takes."
The silence that followed was thick with unspoken violence. Caleb understood then why she'd run, why she'd fought, and why men were hunting her with such determination. "They won't find you here," Caleb said firmly. "I give you my word." Nora turned to him, her eyes shining in the twilight. "You've already given me more than I had any right to ask for. You've treated me with more respect than any man has in over a year. I don't understand why, but I'm grateful." "Nothing to understand. It's just decent." "Decent," Nora repeated softly. "I'd almost forgotten what that looked like."
As the week passed, Caleb found himself increasingly aware of Nora's presence, the way she moved through his house, bringing life back to rooms that had been dead for 3 years. The way she listened when he spoke, really listened, her eyes intent on his face. The way she laughed, a sound he heard more frequently as she healed, soft and genuine. He caught himself watching her sometimes, watching the way sunset light caught in her dark hair, the way her hands moved, graceful and sure, as she kneaded bread dough or mended a shirt, the way her face softened when she looked out at the prairie, as if she were seeing beauty where he saw only dust and grass. It felt like betrayal. Sarah had been gone only 3 years. He still wore his wedding ring, still slept on his side of the bed, leaving hers untouched, still spoke to her sometimes in the darkness, telling her about his day, asking her advice. But Sarah was gone, and Nora was here, alive and real, and looking at him sometimes with an expression he couldn't quite read. One evening, nearly 2 weeks after Nora's arrival, Caleb came in from the fields to find her standing in the middle of the kitchen, staring at her hands. She'd been cutting vegetables and she'd nicked her finger. A small cut, barely bleeding, but she stood frozen, her face gone white. "Nora?" Caleb moved quickly to her side. "What's wrong?" "Blood," she whispered. "I see blood, and I'm back in that room, with Ruby on the floor and Thorne screaming, and I can't remember." He took her trembling hands in his, wrapping a clean cloth around the cut. "You're here. You're safe. That's all that matters." "But what if I did kill her?" The words burst out of her like a confession. "What if I'm a murderer, and you've been sheltering me and—" "Nora, look at me." She raised her eyes to his, and he saw the terror there, the guilt, the uncertainty. "I don't know what happened in that room," Caleb said steadily, "but I know you. I've watched you nurse a baby bird that fell from the barn eaves. I've seen you cry over a wildflower you accidentally trampled. Whatever happened, if you were involved, it was self-defense. And even if it wasn't," he hesitated, then committed to the truth, "I don't care. You're not going back to that life. Not while I'm standing." Tears spilled down her cheeks. "Why do you care? You barely know me." "I know enough." The words came out rougher than he intended. He was standing too close, could feel the heat of her, smell the lavender soap she'd found in Sarah's old trunk. "I know you're brave and kind and stronger than you think. I know coming home to you feels right in a way nothing has since—" He stopped himself, stepping back. "I'm sorry, that was inappropriate." But Nora reached out, catching his sleeve. "Please, don't apologize." Her voice was barely a whisper. "It feels right to me too, and that terrifies me, because I don't trust my own judgment anymore. But when I'm with you, I feel safe. I feel seen, not as something to use, but as a person." They stood there in the fading light, the moment stretching between them like something fragile and infinitely precious. Caleb wanted to pull her close, to promise her everything would be all right, to kiss the tears from her cheeks. But he'd learned that wanting something didn't make it possible, and Nora had been used enough. "You are a person, a remarkable one, and whatever you're feeling, it's real. You don't need to doubt it." She smiled through her tears, and for the first time since Sarah's death, Caleb felt something other than grief take root in his chest, something that felt dangerously like hope. 3 weeks after Nora's arrival, Caleb woke to the smell of rain. It was a miracle in this parched land, a gift from a sky that had been mercilessly blue for months. He rose from his bedroll in the main room. He'd insisted Nora keep the bedroom, despite her protests, and stepped onto the porch. The storm was still distant, a line of dark clouds rolling across the prairie like an invading army. Lightning flickered in their depths. The wind picked up, carrying the sweet, dusty scent of coming rain. Behind him, he heard the bedroom door open. Nora emerged, wrapped in one of his old shirts over her nightgown, her hair loose around her shoulders. She'd put on weight in the past weeks, her face fuller, the hollow shadows under her eyes beginning to fade. She looked younger like this, softer, beautiful. "Is that rain?" she asked, wonder in her voice. "Coming on fast. We'll need to secure the barn doors, make sure the water barrels are out." But neither of them moved. They stood side by side, watching the storm approach, feeling the first cool breeze in weeks caress their faces. When the first fat drops began to fall, Nora laughed, a sound of pure, uncomplicated joy, and stepped off the porch into the yard. "Nora, you'll catch your death!" But she was already spinning in the rain, arms outstretched, face turned to the sky. The water soaked through her clothing in moments, plastering the thin fabric to her body, but she didn't care. She looked wild and free, like something from a painting. Caleb watched her, his heart doing something complicated in his chest. Then, without quite deciding to, he stepped off the porch and into the rain. Nora turned to him, water streaming down her face, her smile incandescent. "Dance with me," she said. "I don't dance." "Neither do I, not anymore. But right now, in this moment, I want to. Please?" How could he refuse? He took her hand, slid his other arm around her waist, and they moved through the rain-soaked yard in something that was barely a dance, clumsy, graceless, perfect. Nora's laughter rang out, and Caleb found himself smiling, really smiling, for the first time in years. When the rain intensified, turning the yard to mud, they stumbled back to the porch, breathless and dripping. Nora's hair hung in dark ropes down her back. Caleb's shirt clung to his chest. They looked at each other and burst out laughing, the kind of laughter that comes from relief, from joy, from the simple pleasure of being alive. "I'll get towels," Caleb managed, but Nora caught his arm, and suddenly they weren't laughing anymore. Her hand was warm against his skin, her eyes searching his face with an intensity that made his breath catch. "Caleb," she whispered, "I need you to know something. These past weeks with you, they've been the happiest of my life, not in spite of everything that happened, but somehow because of it, because it led me here, to you." "Nora," she drew a shaky breath, "let me finish, please. I know I have no right to feel this way. I know you're still grieving your wife. I know I'm damaged goods, that I come with a past that could destroy you. But I'm falling in love with you, and I needed you to know. Even if you can't, even if you don't—" He kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss. It was 3 years of grief and loneliness and desperate need, meeting 3 years of pain and survival and hope. Her hands fisted in his wet shirt, pulling him closer. His arms went around her, lifting her against him, as if he could absorb her into himself, keep her safe forever in the cage of his ribs. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Caleb pressed his forehead to hers. "I'm not good at words, never have been, but you need to know, you're not damaged. You're not your past. You're the woman who makes me want to wake up in the morning, who makes this empty house feel like home again, who makes me believe I might deserve a second chance at happiness." "Do you?" Nora asked, her voice trembling. "Do you love me?" God help me, yes. The words seemed torn from somewhere deep inside him. "I love you, Nora Wayne. I think I've loved you since the moment I found you in my barn, looking at me like you were deciding whether I was going to be your salvation or your end." She kissed him again, softer this time, tender. "My salvation," she murmured against his lips. "Definitely my salvation." They stood there on the porch, wrapped in each other's arms, while the rain washed the dust from the land and the past from their shoulders. For the first time in years, Caleb allowed himself to imagine a future,
A future with Nora by his side, with children's laughter filling the empty rooms, with love softening the hard edges of survival. It was a beautiful dream. He should have known it was too good to last.
The riders came 4 days later. Caleb was in the north pasture, mending fence, when he saw the dust cloud approaching. 3 horses, moving at a steady pace. His stomach tightened. He had been expecting this, had known it would come eventually, but he'd hoped for more time. He rode hard for the house, his horse's hooves thundering across the dry grass. Nora was hanging laundry in the yard, her face turned to the sun. When she heard him coming, she looked up, and the color drained from her face. She'd seen the dust, too. "Inside," Caleb barked, swinging down from his horse. "Lock the door. Don't come out no matter what you hear." "Caleb!" "Now, Nora, please." She grabbed the laundry basket and ran for the house. Caleb heard the door slam, the bolt slide home. He turned to face the approaching riders, his hand resting casually on the pistol at his hip. The 3 men reined up in front of the house, their horses stamping and blowing. 2 were ranch hands by the look of them, rough men with hard eyes and harder lives. But the 3rd man was different. He sat his horse like a king, surveying his domain, dressed in a fine black suit despite the heat. His face was handsome in a cold, aristocratic way, with pale eyes that missed nothing. Richard Thorne. "Good afternoon," Thorne said, his voice cultured, almost friendly. "I'm looking for a woman. Dark hair, dark eyes, might be injured. She's wanted for questioning in relation to a murder. You seen anyone like that?" Caleb kept his face carefully blank. "Just me out here, been that way for years." One of the hired men spat tobacco juice into the dust. "We tracked her this way. Trail led right to your property. Lot of drifters pass through. I don't bother them, they don't bother me." Thorne's eyes narrowed. "You're lying, Mr. Stone, Caleb Stone, and I don't take kindly to being called a liar on my own land." "My apologies." Thorne smiled, didn't reach his eyes. "Let me be more direct. The woman I'm looking for is named Nora Wayne, though she may be going by Nora. She killed my business associate, Madame Ruby Delacroix, and fled. She's dangerous, Mr. Stone, unstable. If you're harboring her out of misplaced chivalry, you're putting yourself at considerable risk. Like I said, haven't seen anyone. Then you won't mind if we search your property, the barn, the house." "Yes, I will mind." Caleb's voice went flat, dangerous. "This is my land, and you're not welcome on it." The 2 hired guns shifted in their saddles, hands drifting toward their weapons. Thorne held up a hand, stopping them. "I'm a reasonable man, Mr. Stone. I'm prepared to pay handsomely for information leading to Miss Wayne's recovery. Say $1,000. That's a fortune out here. Enough to expand your operation, buy more cattle, live comfortably for years."
$1,000? It was a staggering sum, more money than Caleb had seen in his life. For a moment, he let himself imagine it, what he could do with that kind of money. Then he thought of Nora, hiding in his house, terrified. Thought of the bruises on her throat in the shape of this man's fingers. Thought of the way she'd looked dancing in the rain, finally free. "Not interested," Caleb said. Thorne's affable mask slipped, revealing the cruelty beneath. "I can make things very difficult for you. I have influence in Silver Creek. A word from me, and you'll find yourself unable to sell your cattle, unable to get supplies, driven off this land." "You done threatening me?" Caleb interrupted. "Because if so, you can get off my property. If not, we can settle this another way." His hand moved to rest on his pistol. "Your choice." The tension stretched taut. The hired guns watched Caleb with the eyes of men judging an opponent, calculating odds. They saw a man who stood like he'd been a soldier once, who held himself with the stillness of someone who'd killed before and would kill again if necessary. Thorne must have seen it too. He gathered his reins, his jaw tight with barely suppressed rage. "This isn't over, Mr. Stone. I always get what I want. Always. And I want Eleanor Wayne. Dead or alive, it makes no difference to me anymore." He wheeled his horse and spurred away, his men following. Caleb watched until they were dust on the horizon. Only then did he allow himself to breathe. The front door opened, and Nora emerged, her face white but composed. "You heard?" Caleb asked. "Every word." She walked to him, placed her hand on his chest, over his racing heart. "You just made an enemy of a very dangerous man. For me." "Worth it." "Is it? $1,000, Caleb. That's everything." He covered her hand with his. "Not everything. Not even close."
That night, neither of them slept. They sat at the kitchen table, a single lamp burning between them, planning. Nora had insisted they face this together, that she would not cower while Caleb fought her battles. He'd argued, of course, but she'd stood firm. She'd spent 6 months being powerless. She would not be powerless again. "He won't give up," Nora said quietly. "Richard Thorne doesn't accept defeat. He'll come back with more men, or he'll find a way to turn the law against us. Then we need to be smarter than him." Caleb leaned forward, his elbows on the table. "Tell me everything you remember about that night, every detail." Nora closed her eyes, and he watched her face tighten with the effort of remembering. "Thorne came to my room. He'd been drinking, but he wasn't drunk. He told me that he'd paid Ruby a premium for me, that tonight I would finally stop playing games. I refused. He grabbed me, started tearing at my clothes. I fought him, scratched his face, hit him. He laughed, said he liked it when they fought." Caleb's hands clenched into fists under the table, but he kept his voice level. Then Ruby burst in. She was furious, not at Thorne, at me. Said I was damaging her investment, that I'd caused her nothing but trouble. She picked up a candlestick from the dresser and raised it to hit me. I think— Nora's breath hitched. "I think Thorne tried to stop her, not to protect me, but because he didn't want his property damaged. They struggled, and then Ruby was on the floor, and there was blood, and Thorne was staring at me with this expression, like he'd just realized an opportunity. He killed her," Caleb said flatly, "and decided to pin it on you. I can't prove it. I don't even trust my own memory. The whole thing is like a nightmare, fragmentary and confused. Then we need to find proof, or we need to make him confess." Nora looked at him with something like admiration in her eyes. "You're not going to suggest I run again?" "Where would you run to? He'd find you. Men like Thorne, they're like dogs with a bone. They don't let go." Caleb reached across the table, took her hand in his. "Besides, I'm not letting you go. Not now, not ever if you'll have me." "Caleb." "I'm serious, Nora. When this is over, when you're safe, I want you to stay. Not as my housekeeper, not out of gratitude or obligation, as my wife, if you'll have me." The words hung in the lamp-lit air between them, weighted with all the unspoken feelings of the past weeks. Nora's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "Yes, yes, of course yes, though you might be proposing to a murderess. I'm proposing to the woman I love. The rest is just details." They sealed the promise with a kiss, soft and lingering, tasting of coffee and hope and defiance. When they finally parted, Caleb stood and held out his hand. "Come on. If we're going to face this together, you need to know how to shoot." Caleb spent the next 2 days teaching Nora to handle a pistol. She was a quick study, her hands steady despite her fear, her focus absolute. By the end of the second day, she could hit a tin can at 20 paces more often than not. "You're a natural," Caleb said, watching her reload with practiced efficiency. "I'm motivated," Nora corrected. "There's a difference." They were in the north pasture, far enough from the house that the gunshots wouldn't immediately alert anyone passing by. The sun was starting its descent toward the horizon, painting the grass gold. It was beautiful country, Caleb thought, worth fighting for, worth dying for if it came to that. "Riders coming," Nora said suddenly, shading her eyes against the sun. 2 of them. Caleb's hand went to his gun, but as the riders drew closer, he relaxed marginally. One of them wore a star on his chest. Sheriff Tom Crawford was a decent man, as sheriffs went. Fair-minded, slow to anger, quick to listen. He'd known Caleb for 15 years, had attended Sarah's funeral, had helped round up strays when Caleb had been too grief-stricken to do it himself. The other man was a stranger, lean and hard-eyed, with a U.S. Marshal's badge pinned to his vest. "Caleb," Sheriff Crawford said, tipping his hat. His eyes flicked to Nora, then back to Caleb. "This is Marshal Jeremiah Wade out of Austin. He's got some questions for you." Wade didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Mr. Stone, I'm investigating the murder of Ruby Delacroix. I'm told you're harboring the primary suspect, a woman named Eleanor Wayne." "I don't know anything about a murder," Caleb said carefully, "but I've got a woman staying with me, yes. She came here injured and asking for help. I gave it." "That woman is wanted for questioning," Wade said. "I'll need to take her into custody." Nora stepped forward, her chin lifted. "I'm Eleanor Wayne, and I didn't kill Ruby Delacroix. Richard Thorne did." Wade's expression didn't change. "That's not what Mr. Thorne says. He claims you attacked Mrs. Delacroix after she tried to stop you from leaving the establishment. He's filed a formal complaint. I have a warrant for your arrest." "Thorne's lying," Nora said steadily. "He tried to force himself on me. Ruby walked in and objected. Not because she cared about me, but because he was damaging her property. They fought, and Thorne struck her with the candlestick. I saw it happen." "Then you'll have a chance to testify to that in court," Wade said, "but I still need to take you in." Caleb stepped between them. "She's not going anywhere." Sheriff Crawford held up his hands. "Now, Caleb, let's not make this harder than it needs to be. Wade here's just doing his job. If Miss Wayne is innocent, a court will sort it out." "A court run by Thorne's friends," Caleb said flatly. "A court where her word as a woman who worked in a brothel will be worth nothing against his as a wealthy, respectable man. You and I both know how that goes, Tom." Face tightened, but he didn't argue. He knew the truth of it.
"Mr. Stone," Wade said, his voice hardening, "I can arrest you for obstruction if you continue to interfere. Step aside." "No." "Caleb, don't," Nora pleaded, touching his arm. "I won't let you go to jail for me. I'll go with them. We'll find another way." "There is another way," Caleb said, his mind racing. He turned to Wade. "What if someone else paid her alleged debt to the establishment? What if she could compensate for any losses Thorne claims to have suffered?" Wade frowned. "This is a murder investigation, not a property dispute. But if her debt was settled, if she'd paid back what's owed, that might influence how the court views the case, might suggest she's not a flight risk, that she has ties to the community." Caleb was grasping at straws, he knew, but he had to try. "I'm prepared to offer everything I have, the deed to this farm, my life savings, my cattle, whatever it takes to secure her freedom." "Caleb, no!" Nora gasped. "This is your land, your home. You can't—" "It's just land," Caleb said, not taking his eyes off Wade. "What's it worth without someone to share it with?" The marshal studied him for a long moment. "That's a significant offer, but it doesn't change the fact that there's a warrant. At most, it might convince a judge to grant bail until trial." "Then let it serve as bail," Caleb pressed. "Keep the deed a surety. If she runs, you get everything, but let her stay here until the trial, please." Crawford spoke up. "That's unusual, but not illegal. Jeremiah, the man's offering his entire livelihood. That's got to count for something." Wade was silent, weighing the decision. Finally, he nodded. "All right, Miss Wayne, you're under house arrest until your trial. You're not to leave this property without permission from me or Sheriff Crawford. Mr. Stone, you're responsible for ensuring she appears when summoned. If she runs, you lose everything. Understood?" "Understood," Caleb said. "And I'll be checking in regularly," Wade warned. "Any sign she's fled, any attempt to leave the area, and I'll arrest you both." After the lawman left, Nora turned to Caleb, tears streaming down her face. "How could you do that?" she demanded. "This land is all you have. It's your past, your future." "You're my future," Caleb interrupted, pulling her into his arms. "Everything else is just details." She clung to him, sobbing into his chest, and he held her while the sun set and the shadows lengthened across the land that might no longer be his. But he didn't regret it, not for a moment.
Some things were worth more than land, more than money or property or security. Some things were worth everything. Nora was one of them. The week before the trial was the longest of Caleb's life. Marshal Wade had been true to his word, stopping by every other day to ensure Nora was still in residence. Each visit left Caleb more uneasy. Wade was thorough, professional, but there was something in his eyes, a skepticism that suggested he'd already decided Nora's guilt. Thorne had been to town, Caleb learned, had bought drinks for half the saloon, told his version of events to anyone who would listen. In his telling, Nora was a violent, unstable woman who'd attacked Ruby in a fit of rage when the madam had tried to help her. He was the grief-stricken friend, seeking justice for a murdered woman who'd been like a mother to him. It was a good story, and it was spreading. "We need a lawyer," Nora said one evening. They were sitting on the porch, watching the stars emerge. "Someone who can counter Thorne's lies." "Lawyers cost money. Money I don't have anymore." The words came out more bitter than Caleb intended. He wasn't angry about the sacrifice. He'd make it again in a heartbeat, but the helplessness gnawed at him. "Then I'll speak for myself," Nora said firmly. "I can be eloquent when I need to be. I was a teacher, remember? I know how to make people listen." Caleb took her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "I know you can, but Nora, you have to understand, there's a good chance this doesn't go our way. Thorne has money, influence. He's painted you as the villain. Even if you tell the truth beautifully, the jury might not believe you." "Then what do you suggest?" Her voice was tight with frustration. "That I accept my fate? Let Thorne win?" "No, I'm saying we need something more than testimony. We need evidence. We need to make him slip up, expose his lies." Caleb paused, an idea forming. "We need to make him angry enough to make a mistake." Nora turned to him, her eyes sharp. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking Richard Thorne is a man who's used to winning, used to owning things, controlling them. And right now, the thing he wants most in the world is you, either in his bed or in a grave. What if we gave him the opportunity to have what he wants, on our terms? You want to use me as bait. It wasn't a question. I want to give him enough rope to hang himself, but I won't do it without your agreement, and I won't let you face him alone." Nora was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the darkness. When she spoke, her voice was steady. "All right, tell me your plan."
2 days later, Caleb rode into Silver Creek alone. The town was small, dusty, little more than a main street with a scattering of buildings, a general store, a saloon, a blacksmith, the sheriff's office. Caleb tied his horse outside the saloon and pushed through the swinging doors. The afternoon crowd was sparse, a few cowboys, a card game in the corner, the bartender polishing glasses. And at a table near the back, surrounded by several well-dressed men, sat Richard Thorne. The conversation died when Caleb entered. All eyes turned to him. Thorne's face shifted through surprise to calculation to cold amusement. "Mr. Stone," Thorne said, gesturing to an empty chair. "What a pleasant surprise. Join us for a drink?" "This won't take long," Caleb said, remaining standing. He pitched his voice to carry through the room. "I came to tell you that Nora Wayne and I are leaving, today. We're heading west, California maybe. Figure by the time the trial date comes around, we'll be too far gone to find." The silence that followed was absolute. Thorne stood slowly, his face flushing with anger. "That would be a mistake, Mr. Stone, a very serious mistake. You'd lose your land, you'd be fugitives, and I would dedicate every resource I have to tracking you down. I'm willing to risk it, because I love her, Thorne, and I won't watch her hang for a murder you committed." The accusation hung in the air like gun smoke. Thorne's eyes went flat, dangerous. "Careful, Stone, those are bold words." "They're true words. You killed Ruby Delacroix, probably because you objected to you forcing yourself on Nora, or maybe just because she was inconvenient. Then you pinned it on Nora and came after her like a dog after a fox." Thorne's hand moved to his hip, but he wasn't armed. Caleb had counted on that. Men like Thorne hired others to do their violence. "You can't prove any of that," Thorne said. "Maybe not, but I can make your life very difficult. See, before we leave, I plan to tell my story to everyone who'll listen. Tell them about the bruises on Nora's throat shaped like fingers, about how you offered me $1,000 for her, about how an innocent murder wouldn't need to pay that kind of money for information. No one will believe you. Maybe, maybe not, but it'll raise questions, make people wonder. And men like you, Thorne, you live on reputation. Once people start wondering, start doubting, well, that's almost as bad as being guilty, isn't it?"
Thorne's face had gone pale with rage. "If you leave, I'll have the marshal hunt you down. I'll put a bounty on your heads. You'll never know peace." "Then I guess we'll die together. Better that than watching you destroy her." Caleb turned and walked out, feeling Thorne's rage like heat against his back. He didn't hurry, didn't show fear. He mounted his horse and rode out of town at an easy pace. But once he was out of sight, he spurred his mount into a gallop. Nora was waiting in the barn when Caleb thundered up. She dressed in her most practical clothes, riding boots, split skirt, one of Caleb's shirts belted at her waist. 2 horses were saddled and ready. "Did it work?" she asked. "Like setting a match to dry grass. He'll come. Tonight, probably. He won't be able to help himself." They'd planned this carefully. Caleb had gone to town to enrage Thorne, to make him reckless. Meanwhile, Nora had sent word to Marshal Wade through Sheriff Crawford's deputy, who'd stopped by that morning. The message was simple. If you want the truth about Ruby Delacroix's murder, come to the Stone Farm tonight at sundown. Now they just had to hope Wade would come, and hope Thorne would incriminate himself. The sun crawled toward the horizon. Caleb and Nora took up positions. Caleb in the barn loft with a rifle, Nora in the house with the pistol he'd taught her to shoot. They'd rehearsed to this. If Thorne came with men, Caleb would fire a warning shot and Nora would hide. If he came alone, they'd confront him together. But they couldn't predict every possibility. The first rider appeared just as the sun touched the horizon, a lone horseman approaching at a measured pace. Marshal Wade, his badge catching the dying light. Caleb felt a surge of relief. The lawman had come. Now they just needed Thorne to show up and damn himself. Wade dismounted, his hand resting on his pistol. "Miss Wayne, Mr. Stone, I got your message. You wanted to talk?" Nora emerged from the house, Caleb from the barn. They'd agreed to tell Wade everything, the whole truth, holding nothing back. But before Nora could speak, the sound of hoofbeats announced more arrivals. 3 riders crested the rise. Thorne and 2 hired guns, the same men who'd come before. They pulled up short when they saw the marshal. "Wade," Thorne said, his voice tight, "what are you doing here?" "I could ask you the same question, Mr. Thorne. This property is under my jurisdiction. Miss Wayne is under house arrest. I received word that Stone was planning to flee with the prisoner. I came to ensure justice was served." "Funny," Wade said. "I received word too, from Miss Wayne herself, asking me to come listen to the truth about Mrs. Delacroix's murder." Thorne's jaw clenched. "The truth is a matter of record. Eleanor Wayne is a murderer." "I didn't kill her," Nora's voice rang out clear and strong. "Marshal Wade, I swear to you, Richard Thorne killed Ruby Delacroix. I witnessed it. He was attacking me, Ruby tried to intervene, and he struck her with a candlestick. Then he blamed me because he knew no one would believe a woman who worked in a brothel over a man of his standing." "That's a lie," Thorne snarled. "She's desperate, grasping at straws." "Is it a lie?" Caleb interrupted, moving to stand beside Nora. "Then how do you explain the bruises on her throat, the one shaped exactly like a man's grip? How do you explain offering me $1,000, a fortune, just for information about her whereabouts? Why would you pay that much for a simple criminal unless you had something to hide?" Wade's eyes had gone sharp, assessing. "Those are fair questions, Mr. Thorne." "I don't have to explain myself to you or anyone," Thorne snapped. "I'm a victim here. Ruby was my friend." "Ruby was your procuress," Nora said coldly. "You paid her to acquire women for your pleasure, and when I refused you, when I fought back, you couldn't stand it, because men like you can't bear to be denied." Thorne's control finally snapped. He spurred his horse forward, murder in his eyes. "You worthless whore! I should have killed you that night along with that interfering old bitch!" The words hung in the air for one crystalline moment. Then Wade's voice cut through. "That sounds like a confession, Mr. Thorne." Thorne froze, realizing what he'd said. His face went from red to white. I didn't mean—" "You confessed to murder," Wade said flatly, "in front of witnesses." His hand moved to his pistol. "Richard Thorne, I'm placing you under arrest for the murder of Ruby Delacroix." "No." Thorne's voice was deadly quiet. "No, I don't think so." He drew a pistol. Where he'd concealed it, Caleb didn't know, and fired. The shot went wide, meant to scare rather than kill. His hired men went for their guns. Everything happened at once. Caleb pushed Nora behind him, raising his rifle. Wade dove for cover, returning fire. One of the hired men went down, clutching his shoulder. The other wheeled his horse, suddenly unwilling to die for Thorne's money. Thorne spurred toward the house, toward Nora, his face twisted with rage. "If I can't have you, no one will." Caleb fired, missed. Thorne was too close, moving too fast. Then Nora stepped out from behind Caleb, the pistol in her hands steady despite her fear, and fired once. The bullet took Thorne in the chest. He jerked back, his own pistol flying from his hand. For a moment, he simply sat there, swaying in the saddle, a look of absolute surprise on his face. Then he toppled sideways and hit the ground.
The sudden silence was deafening. Nora stood frozen, the gun still raised, her face pale. Caleb gently took the pistol from her trembling hands. "It's over," he said softly. "It's over." Wade approached Thorne's body, checked for a pulse, then straightened. Dead, clean shot through the heart. He looked at Nora, his expression unreadable. Self-defense. 3 witnesses to confirm it. Mr. Thorne drew first, threatened your life. "I killed him," Nora whispered. "You survived him," Caleb corrected, pulling her into his arms. "There's a difference." The inquest took 3 days. Marshal Wade testified to Thorne's confession to his attack on Nora and Caleb. Sheriff Crawford corroborated the story of Thorne's obsession, his threats, his attempts to use the law as a weapon. The hired man who'd fled gave testimony in exchange for leniency, describing how Thorne had bragged about getting away with murder, about framing that uppity schoolteacher. Most damning of all was the evidence found in Thorne's hotel room, letters between him and Ruby discussing the acquisition of suitable girls, ledgers showing payments for women transported under false pretenses, and a blood-stained handkerchief monogrammed with his initials, carelessly hidden in his trunk. The verdict was unanimous. Ruby Delacroix had been murdered by Richard Thorne. Nora Wayne had acted in self-defense when she killed her attacker. All charges against her were dropped. Caleb expected to feel triumphant. Instead, he felt hollow, exhausted. It was over, but the cost had been high. The deed to his land was still held as surety, and there was no guarantee he'd get it back without a lengthy legal battle. "Mr. Stone?" He looked up to find Marshal Wade approaching, a folder under his arm. They were standing outside the courthouse, waiting for Nora to finish giving her final statement. "I wanted to return these to you," Wade said, handing him the folder.
the deed to your property, along with a letter from the territorial judge clearing you of any obligation. Since Miss Wayne was innocent, the bail terms are void." Caleb took the folder, hardly daring to believe it. "I get my land back?" "You were willing to give up everything for an innocent woman. The judge felt that deserved recognition." Wade paused. "For what it's worth, I misjudged you, both of you. I'm sorry. You were doing your job. I was making assumptions. There's a difference." Wade tipped his hat. "Good luck to you both." After the marshal left, Caleb stood in the fading afternoon light, the deed to his land in his hands, and felt the weight of the past months finally begin to lift. They'd survived. Against all odds, they'd survived. "Caleb?" Nora emerged from the courthouse, looking tired but unburdened. The shadows that had haunted her eyes since the night he'd found her in his barn were finally beginning to fade. "It's over," she said wonderingly. "It's really over." "It's over." He showed her the deed, "and we get to keep the farm." She laughed, a sound of pure relief and joy, and threw her arms around his neck. He lifted her, spinning her in a circle right there in the street, not caring who saw. When he set her down, she was crying and laughing at the same time. "Take me home, Caleb," she whispered. "Take me home."
They were married 3 weeks later. It was a small ceremony held in the little church in Silver Creek. Sheriff Crawford stood up as Caleb's witness. Mrs. Henderson, who ran the general store and who'd been kind to Nora during the trial, stood for her. The preacher was the same man who'd buried Sarah 3 years ago, and if he noticed Caleb's voice breaking when he said his vows, he had the grace not to mention it. Nora wore a simple blue dress, but to Caleb she'd never looked more beautiful. Her hair was pinned up with wild flowers, her eyes shone with unshed tears, and when he slipped the plain gold band on her finger, Sarah's ring, which he'd cleaned and polished until it gleamed, she smiled at him with such love that his breath caught. "And now pronounce you husband and wife," the preacher said. "You may kiss your bride." And Caleb did, thoroughly, to the scattered applause of the small gathering. When they finally broke apart, Nora was blushing, and he was grinning like a fool. They held a modest reception at the farm. Nothing fancy, just cake and coffee and neighbors who'd come to wish them well. As the sun set and the guests departed, Caleb and Nora stood on the porch of their home, watching the prairie turn gold and purple in the dying light. "Mrs. Stone," Caleb said, testing the name on his tongue. "I like the sound of that," Nora replied, leaning against him. "Though I'll miss being Miss Wayne. She was a fighter. She still is. She just has a different name now." Nora turned in his arms, her hands coming up to frame his face. "I love you, Caleb Stone. I never thought I'd get to say that to anyone. Never thought I'd be standing here, married, safe, happy. You gave me that." "You gave it to me too," he said quietly. "Gave me a reason to live again instead of just surviving. Made me remember that the world can be good, that people can be kind, that love doesn't die just because you lose it once." They kissed as the stars began to emerge, one by one in the darkening sky, and when Caleb swept Nora into his arms and carried her across the threshold of their home, she was laughing, that wonderful sound he'd first heard when she danced in the rain, free and joyous and alive. The door closed behind them, shutting out the darkness, leaving only warmth and light, and the promise of all the tomorrows they would build together. Epilogue. 2 years later. The schoolhouse stood at the edge of Silver Creek, a modest building of whitewashed wood with real glass windows and a bell tower that rang each morning to call the children to their lessons. It had been Nora's dream, and Caleb had made it reality, using part of the reward money they'd received after Thorne's criminal enterprise was fully exposed and his assets seized. On this particular autumn morning, Nora stood at the front of the classroom, her hand resting unconsciously on her rounded belly, watching her students bent over their slates. There were 12 of them, ranging from 6 to 14,
boys and girls from the local ranches and the town itself. They called her Mrs. Stone, and they adored her. "Rebecca, can you read the next passage?" Nora asked gently. The girl, 10 years old, with braids and a missing front tooth, stood and began to read, her voice clear and confident. Nora felt a swell of pride. Rebecca had been barely literate when she'd started school 6 months ago. Now she was reading at grade level. This was why she taught. This moment of watching a mind unfold, of seeing a child discover their own potential. It was the same joy she'd felt in Philadelphia, but sweeter somehow, because she'd fought so hard to reclaim it. The school day ended at 3. Nora dismissed her students, watching them pour out into the afternoon sun with their usual exuberance. Then she gathered her books and stepped outside, where Caleb waited with the wagon. He was leaning against it, his hat pushed back, his face creased by sun and wind, but still handsome to her eyes. More than handsome, beloved. When he saw her, his whole expression softened. "How were the little scholars today?" he asked, helping her into the wagon. "Brilliant, as usual." Rebecca finished her reader, Tommy finally mastered his multiplication tables, and Sarah Miller brought me wildflowers. She gestured to the bouquet on the seat beside her. "Sarah, huh? That's a good name." "It is." Nora took his hand, placed it on her belly. "Which is why I thought we might use it, if it's a girl." Caleb's eyes widened. "Are you sure?" "The midwife confirmed it yesterday. We're having a girl, Caleb, due in March." He let out a whoop that startled the horses and pulled Nora into a kiss that had her laughing against his mouth. "A daughter," he said wonderingly when they finally broke apart. "We're having a daughter." "We are. I hope you're ready for tea parties and hair ribbons." "I'm ready for anything, as long as I have you." They drove home through the golden afternoon, talking about names and nurseries and futures. The farm, when they reached it, looked prosperous. The fences mended, the barn rebuilt, new cattle grazing in the pasture. Caleb had used his share of the reward money to expand the operation, and it was paying off. They weren't wealthy, but they were comfortable. More importantly, they were happy. That night, after a dinner of roast chicken and fresh vegetables from Nora's garden, they sat on the porch, as they did most evenings, watching the stars emerge. Nora was curled against Caleb's side, his arm around her shoulders, one hand resting protectively on her belly.
"Do you ever think about that night?" she asked quietly. "The night you found me in the barn?" "Sometimes." Caleb's voice was thoughtful. "I think about how different my life would be if I'd made a different choice, if I'd turned you away or turned you in. I'd still be alone, still just going through the motions of living without really being alive. I think about it too, about how close I came to giving up, to just letting them catch me. If your barn had been a mile further, if I'd collapsed a minute sooner." She shuddered. "But I didn't. I made it to you. And you saved me." "We saved each other," Caleb corrected. "You brought me back to life, Nora. Gave me a reason to hope again. Made this empty house into a home." "It's a good home," Nora said softly. "A happy home. And it's going to be even better when our daughter arrives." "Sarah," Caleb said, testing the name. "Sarah Stone." "Sarah Stone," Nora agreed. "Named for the woman who loved you first, raised by the woman who loves you now. She'll know she comes from love, that she's wanted. That's all any child can ask for." They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the night sounds of the prairie, crickets and wind and the distant lowing of cattle. Above them, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent and eternal. But here on this porch, in this moment, with this woman in his arms and a daughter on the way, Caleb felt blessed beyond measure. He'd lost everything once, his innocence to war, his wife to sickness, his hope to grief. But he'd found it all again in the broken woman who'd stumbled into his barn seeking sanctuary. She'd been running from death, and he'd been courting it through loneliness and isolation. Together,
They'd chosen life. "I love you, Nora Stone," he said into the darkness. "I love you too, Caleb Stone," she replied. "Forever." And there, under the vast Texas sky, in a farmhouse that had known both sorrow and joy, two wounded souls held each other close and dreamed of the future they would build together. A future filled with children and laughter and love. The past would always be there, a shadow that shaped them, but it no longer defined them. They had survived their trials by fire, and they had emerged stronger, wiser, and bound together by something deeper than circumstance or need. They had emerged with love, the kind of love that heals, that transforms, that endures. And that, Caleb thought, as Nora's breathing deepened into sleep against his chest, was the greatest miracle of all. The prairie wind whispered through the grass, carrying the promise of rain. Above, a shooting star streaked across the sky, bright and brief and beautiful. Caleb made a wish on it, though he knew he didn't need to. All his wishes had already come true. He had Nora. He had his land. He had a daughter on the way. He had a future worth living for. And he had learned at last that love was not something you lost and never found again. It was something that could rise from the ashes, phoenix-like, if you had the courage to open your heart one more time. The night deepened, the stars burned, and in a small farmhouse on the edge of Silver Creek, two wounded souls found wholeness in each other's arms. It was enough. It was everything. The end.
Dear listeners of Light Romantic Stories, thanks so much for tuning in. If you enjoyed this, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Let us know in the comments what city you're listening from. We'd love to hear from you.